First lecture video, we're going to contextualize Sharpeville, and then we're going to talk about the causes, and that's where that's going to stop, and then we'll do another one for the events and things. We're going to do this kind of step by step. So let's go and talk about it. So we're looking at Sharpeville. We're looking at the dramatic turning point to the South African civil rights movement. As a historian, when I first uncovered Sharpeville probably about 5 years ago, because I never really studied South Africa before, but when I read about Sharpeville, it was a shocking moment, and I didn't quite comprehend it. I had to go back and rethink and process, look at primary sources, look at some secondary sources of the era as well, and I kind of pieced together. And I began to realize that the Sharpeville massacre was actually created more by the state. So I'll just tell you, when we look at the causes, I do believe as a historian that the Sharpeville incident was manufactured by the South African government. This is what the South African government wanted. So put that in your mindset and think about it. To what degree am I right with that? But let's go look at the contextualization. We've already talked about key protests. We've talked about the idea about the Defiance Campaign. We've talked about the People's Congress and the Freedom Charter. We talk about the Alexander bus boycott. So we piece these together, right? And if we want to throw in the program of action to start the whole thing out with the May Day sit-in, stay at home, we can just kind of piece this together. And now the question is, what does the ANC want? And the ANC wanted civil rights. They wanted equality. They wanted voting rights. They wanted suffrage. They wanted to get rid of the pass laws. They wanted to get rid of the cattle laws. They wanted to get rid of the land reform laws that absolutely disenfranchised them economically. And what was the success of that? Outside of the Alexander bus boycott, there is no real success. And I think that's something we have to kind of think through and process, because peaceful, nonviolent protests failed to achieve any goals. And in many ways, the apartheid government is going to further entrench, because how do they respond to the Defiance Campaign, the Criminal Amendment Act, the Public Safety Act, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, and the Natives Resettlement Act? So over a 2-year period, we go from segregation into apartheid, right? We're looking into apartheid, because as we get to the Natives Resettlement Act, we're going to start seeing the forcible removal of people into the group areas. So once again, we just kind of look at that. So let's look at now. What's the response to the Freedom Charter of the Alexander bus boycott? The Criminal Procedure Act, making more arbitrary arrests. Riotous Assemblies Act, define what riots were in a broader way. The Promotion of Self-Government, Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959. All of a sudden, we begin to realize that every peaceful protest that the Africans put to put South Africa on the international stage, South African government is going to react and further entrench them. And think about the treason trial. The treason trial was this long-lasting 1956 to 1961 moment in which the leaders were arbitrarily arrested. Prosecutors knew they didn't have enough evidence. They knew that they did not have high treason, and yet instead of stopping the trial, they continued the trial because they wanted to penalize the Africans for wanting civil rights. So I want to point that that's what we see. That's what we see going on. We see this contextualization in which the ANC and the Africans are attempting to gain rights, and apartheid is doing the reverse. It's a statement of privilege, it's power. So now, what are the causes? So we see the contextualization, and now we're going to jump into 1959. 1959, on the eve of the March Sharpeville massacre, we begin to see, so we have three things historians have argued. What created the atmosphere? What caused that? And I do think there are some historians that have validity when they talk about the civil rights movement having a division. There's a frustration of momentum, obviously. But within the ANC, there's also a division. And this is where it's so important, where the Freedom Charter attempted to unite the program, unite the progress, unite the entire civil rights movement. By the time of 1959, that unity is crumbling. And I do think it's probably because Mandela from CYL, he sees it the world differently than an older Lutuli. Lutuli still wanted to continue to use peaceful protests. He wanted to continue to process that in hopes that he can negotiate either with the South African government or through the peaceful no protest, the United Nations and Great Britain would have more pressure in them. Mandela's like, no, that's not enough. The South African government has proven they're not going to act for the betterment of Africans. So there's a division there. Mandela wanted more direct action. Well, if that's not enough, all of a sudden you have the formation in 1959, you have the formation of the Pan-African Congress led by Robert Sobukwe. And when we look at Robert Sobukwe, it's really about Africanism. It's the concept in which the movement has to be Africans. Sobukwe was rejecting help from the white communists. He rejected the concept that the SAIC was going to work out with them. He said that Africans must unite amongst themselves, and only through that can they have progress. And they were looking at more direct action in the sense of where Mandela may have been that militant nonviolence. We're going to begin to see how PAC was more of that violence. So we see these three components: nonviolence, militant nonviolence, and the shift of violence as early as 1959 with Robert Sobukwe. So the civil rights movement in itself was not leading. And one of the things, this is what the government, South African government did, is instead of these two guys being the face of the movement, the South African government promoted Robert Sobukwe internationally. Robert Sobukwe became the face of the civil rights movement. And I don't think Robert Sobukwe really wanted that. But now all of a sudden, the Afrikaners were like, oh my God, this is what the civil rights movement is. This is Africanism. They're Black supremacists. They want to dominate. They want to lead a white genocide. And it played in even though all that is not true, it created confusion in the West. Because again, the West didn't quite know exactly what was going on. And again, we could talk about the reasons for that. But within the divisions, there's fractures, and that's going to create chaos. Now, international pressure, there's two bodies that we're going to look at: the United Nations and Great Britain. The United Nations. Initially, the United Nations had a difficult time dealing with formation of apartheid because apartheid appeared to be Nazi-like, which it was Nazi-like. And the United Nations, like, we just defeated Nazism. So what does this look like? But as the Cold War was beginning, as the chaos was beginning, the United Nations wasn't quite sure what steps to take. Plus, the United Nations in 1948 was a very white organization, very European, Eurocentric organization. So their bias was, even though they didn't realize their bias was towards the Afrikaners. It wouldn't be until the Indians were the ones that were pushing for change. As early as 1946, India began to call for investigations in the treatment of Indian South Africans. And there was, because again, remember, they're there. Remember, Gandhi was there originally. So there's this connectivity there, connection. And India is like, what are we going to do about it? So the Indian representative of the United Nations, as early as 1948, 49, begins to push out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He said, see, this is the statement that was made in 1945 at the San Francisco Conference that said all humans deserve human rights. And if you don't remember that document, you may want to pull that up and read that yourself. But it's a very simple document that basically stated that the government could not infringe upon the basic inalienable rights of a human being. And if that's true, then the United Nations has to act. Well, finally, in 1956, the United Nations makes a very minor action. And in the face of the Defiance campaign, India pushed for a establishment of a task force. I do believe this is important because as the United Nations begins to form a task force to investigate South Africa, this creates a defensiveness of South Africa. South Africa, the National Party, begins to think hey, wait a minute. We demand independence. We have the ability. We're a sovereign country. How dare you judge us for how we are treating our people? So this is going to create a polarization, if you will, of South Africa and the United Nations. Now, in the midst of all that, as the United Nations is putting pressure on South Africa, the British Commonwealth was also putting pressure. Remember in 1911, when the Union of South Africa was formed, they were part of the British Commonwealth, which is the cool, hip 20th century version of the British Empire: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. These were four parts of the Commonwealth where they were sophisticated enough to have their own independent government overseeing their domestic affairs, but they were still connected to the foreign policy of the British Commonwealth. And the British Commonwealth, the British Prime Minister took great pride of overseeing their Commonwealths. So that's kind of the format, right? And in the 1950s, if you go back to your freshman notes, there's a wave of decolonization. We talk about Nkrumah, we can talk about Kenya and Kenyatta. We can even talk about Nasser if you wanted to, which we will probably talk a little bit later. We're unfolding, and what was once a colonized continent was becoming now an independent continent. One by one, these African states were declaring their independence, and the British and Nigeria and some other countries, they decided, gosh, we have to, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, he took a goodwill tour through Africa. He started, I believe, from Ghana and went to Kenya. The whole point was it's a PR campaign to try to make Great Britain look a little bit better than it did as everything was decolonizing. And we'll see a little bit later, because like Belgium did not look good during this time period with the Congo. So Harold Macmillan just kind of wanted to shake hands. As he stops in February 1st, I think it's February 1st, February 1960, he now is at South Africa. He actually goes into Parliament. And as he goes to the South African Parliament, he has a very famous speech called The Wind of Change. And look what he says. The wind of change is blowing through the continent, whether we like it or not. This growth of national consciousness is a political fact. I think this is that statement that Harold Macmillan's like, hey, we're all white supremacists, basically. We understand that whites are probably superior, but the Africans are now moving, they're rising up, they're challenging us, and it's time for us to evolve because we have to be progressive. We have to lose our bias, basically. And then he finishes it up. As a fellow member of the Commonwealth, which is South Africa, it is our earnest desire to give South Africa our support. But there are some aspects of your policies which make it impossible for us to do without being false to our own deep convictions. He is calling out the apartheid government. I believe this February moment is so important. And I do hope it's in your notes, guys, that the wind of change really calls out. We're less than 5 weeks away from the 6 weeks away from Sharpeville Massacre. And this is the moment in which I can imagine the National Party sitting there listening to this British Prime Minister, in which we already know the Afrikaners don't particularly like British. That goes all the way back to the Boer War. And there's this anxiety and angst. And here's Harold Macmillan saying, oh, by the way, you're doing wrong. You are morally wrong. Well, that creates friction. And now all of a sudden, the National Party begins to react. And I do believe this is almost the immediate cause. I do believe the South African government is now on the fringe of doing something very harsh. I do believe that Verwoerd is negotiating with his police department. What can we do? How can we show the world that we are in control? And this is where we see the South African reactionary policies. The Police Act of 1958 militarized the police force. It granted sweeping police powers to enforce, to be able to arbitrarily arrest and enforce laws against the Africans. There's a heightened state of fear. There were 9 South African policemen that had been murdered weeks before Sharpeville. So as we begin to kind of get closer to the event, I do want to point out the police force were fearful of what could happen. Now, on the flip side, clearly the over-policing created this chaos. And there's a militarization of police. Look at this militarized vehicle. That appears to me to be an army vehicle, something you see in battle. Well, that is a police vehicle. So when we begin to see this polarization, you have the white Afrikaner police over-policing the Africans, creating chaos. The Police Act of 1958 gave them sweeping powers to do so. We look at all the other acts, and now we see this kind of chaos. And that's where we are right now. And that's kind of where we're looking at. Which of those 3 are the most important? I do think you've already heard me say I do believe ultimately it was going to be the South African government looking for an opportunity to give the finger to the world. And let's say the Eve. Now, in going into 1960, the ANC, Albert Lutuli, is attempting to regain kind of a united civil rights movement. They announced that there's going to be the year of the past, that they're going to begin to pass this, they're going to organize a series of small scale protests. And when I say small scale, they're going to do local. They're going to do Sharpeville maybe one day, Johannesburg another day, and they're trying to illustrate. The goal was to show the economic importance of the Africans, right? Well, Robert Sobukwe says, screw those small scale. It's cute they're going to take a whole year, but we're going to do a larger scale protest. And the PAC is trying to upstage, if you will, the ANC. And it was identified that in March, there's going to be this ginormous event. And that enormous event was going to be based on this idea of no bail, no defense, no fine. That is the slogan. And what it means no bail, we're not going to bail ourselves out. No defense because there's no defense against unjust laws. No fine because we're not going to pay the fines of unjust laws. The whole point was to overwhelm the penal system. And here we see a cool image of what Sobukwe had anticipated. They're going to burn their passbooks because they're human beings. They don't need the passbooks. They want to be treated just like the Afrikaners. And this is where we are now on the Sharpeville Massacre. I want to tell you that this is a highly organized event. Robert Sobukwe and his PAC officials, PAC officials, had went to each of the localities they're going to protest. They informed the police of exactly what's going to happen. They tell the numbers. In Sharpeville, they say we're going to have about 5,000 to 8,000 people. We're going to come to the police headquarters. We're going to burn our passbooks. And when you feel like enough's enough, go ahead and tell the leader, and the leader's going to organize, and we're going to go over to the football field, the football pitch, which is the soccer area, and we'll sit there, and you'll be able to systematically arrest us. So that's the event. That's what they had planned. And they had told the police what to do. And as they did this, they were hoping that the police would then create, okay, this is what's going to happen. They give them a couple weeks ahead of time, and they'll be ready to be prepared. So that's the predictability. The PAC believes that when they go to Sharpeville, that there's going to be some organization. The police will be there. The police will know what the game plan is, and they know what to do. Well, it appears 5,000 gathered. If we look at the South African records from the government, they say 25,000. I kind of look at the white. There are white reporters there that were from Britain and a couple other countries, maybe even New Zealand, and they really focus on from 5,000 to 8,000. So when the South African government's trying to say 25,000, I think they're attempting to doctor the numbers to justify what they did. Something else the South African government has pushed out was that there's a bit of controversy. They believe that Africans were forcing other Africans to participate. I put that out there just to show you so that there's some validity to that. There's some, the idea. But again, I do think that that's more of a reactionary statement. And I want to point out when the protest started, the leaders of this protest were shocked to see that the Sharpeville police force was undermanned. And I think the reason they were undermanned is they already had the extras outside the city. They were prepared to enter in, but what they wanted to do, they were looking for a moment to destabilize. And I know that sounds conspiratorial, but I will tell you, everything that appears in the Sharpeville, it's going to be the police officers that are going to ultimately create the moment. The growing tensions. As the growing tensions continue to grow, the crowd increased by midday. By this time, it's going to be about 10,000. Police bring their enforcements, and you see the image here. A white journalist stated, and this is where I find it very fascinating, when we hear a white journalist report that the crowd was more festive than belligerent. That is important because the South African government is attempting to paint a picture soon after the event that this was a riot. It was violence. The Africans were acting animalistic, instinctive, if you will. Those are all social Darwinist statements that they would use. And this white journalist is like, no, that's not true. And kind of pushed out another narrative. And unfortunately, despite the truth of the aspect, the massacre happens. A police airplane comes in and does a flyover. And as it swoops down, maybe not quite that low, as it swoops down, it creates chaos. People begin, the organized rebellion begins. Oh my gosh, at that moment, the leader's arrested. The leader's arrested. So when you arrest a leader, all of a sudden, the leader, all of a sudden the leader's there, you arrest them. Now there's going to be chaos. So the planes, they're arresting the leader. It creates a destabilization. You bring in the heavy military trucks, brings destabilization. And at that moment, that's when the massacre begins. And you see the image here. I want to point out the entire protest is running away from the police. They're not running towards the police. Another really famous picture. I want to point out in this picture, you have the police officers are clearly in a position of defensibility. So when we look at this, all the stories about them being victims of chaos, everything about these images tell a different story. This is the aftermath. What we see here, you guys, remember, there are 69 dead. I believe there's 69 dead, 180 injured. Most of them were shot in the back. This image, the child dead behind the police officers. You can almost hear the police officers talking about it was their fault. The children's fault, not theirs. The children's fault. They should have been protesting. At the outcome, the next couple of days, you have the famous funeral. Look at all the coffins. The message is being conveyed here, especially this one. I see a long road of death. Sharpeville, at the end of Sharpeville, I do believe that this brings an end to the nonviolence. It brings an end to the nonviolence, and we're going to talk more about that in the next video. But I just want to point out that what we've done, we've covered contextualization, we've talked about causes, and we've talked about the event. And now we're looking at this image. We see a road of coffins. I wonder if the author is trying to say that the civil rights movement it was a path to death. But again, that's for you guys to ponder.